All right, I'm here with Ken Babcock, co-founder and CEO of Tango, a platform that lets you delegate and get tasks off of your plate easily. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric.
Yeah. No, so the work that you do, the product you build is something that I've used a lot in my own practice. It's something that I recommend to several of my clients to again just help them delegate and elevate. So I appreciate the work you're doing. But before we dive into that, I'd love to just hear a little bit about you and your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been sort of a non-linear, but I think that's kind of the norm these days. Um,
Yeah.
Started my career in consulting in New York, traveling to clients all over the country and kind of random random places. Was there for about a year when I got an opportunity to move to San Francisco, join Uber, at a pretty incredible phase in that company's growth. I mean, product market fit was very clear, but it
Mhm.
was about scaling. Um, so a really fascinating time. Lots of launching into new markets, turning sort of manual processes into like productized, um,
Mhm.
versions, and just an incredible time. So I stayed there for about 4.5 years, held roles in uh, data science, product strategy, operations, specifically centered on launch. And so um, it was very formative for my career, that experience of just seeing a generational company and how it scaled. And a lot of
Mhm.
the learnings that I took from that eventually, informed what we're doing at Tango, which I'll get into later. Um, After Uber, worked in an incubator as a founder in residence, thinking, that would be my opportunity to go and found a company. Another great learning experience. I call it my founding up with training wheels experience. But ultimately, while I was there, got accepted to Harvard Business School. Um, and that to me at the time, felt like a way to take a step back, really think about what I wanted to be doing. I knew I wanted to start a company in some way, shape, or form, but I hadn't really thought about, okay, what's the thing I'm so passionate about, or what's the experience that I have so deeply that I should go start it. At HBS, really allowed for some time to reflect. And HBS also proved to be kind of a brief experience. I met my co-founders day one. Not that we had the idea day one, but we started, talking pretty quickly thereafter about what we wanted to do, why we were at school, what things we were passionate about. And there was this really strong alignment. We cared a lot about productivity, cared a lot about helping people, just be their best at work. We had been in situations where it was either us or our colleagues, when they're getting stuck or when they're getting frustrated. We wanted to alleviate that. And so, started working on what would become Tango in January of 2020. Obviously,
Mhm.
2 months later, the pandemic hit, which changed everything for us, both, from a school standpoint, but then also from a customer discovery standpoint, when we were talking to people about Tango, which at the time was really around digitizing shadowing, making shadowing
Mhm.
sort of asynchronous. People were starting to play with Loom, but we were thinking about, how could we improve Loom, and just the level of urgency and the shift in tone with a lot of those conversations made us feel like, oh my gosh, we have to go build this. And
Mhm.
school at the time was, remote. It was on Zoom. It was not that great. And so we said, all right, let's go do it. And fast forward 3 years later, we've got a team of 40 distributed across the country. We've got over 400,000 users of the product. And the momentum just continues. And so we feel very lucky to be, where we're at today. And it was a few little insights that kind of kickstarted that. And the snowball just kept kind of rolling down the hill.
So let's rewind a little bit because I want to. There's a couple interesting tidbits along the way. So when you were at Uber, I'm interested in what were some of the big scaling challenges that you were dealing with?
Yeah. So when you read about Uber, and when most people look at it from the outside in, they see, oh wow, what an amazing growth story. And that's true. But what I would say is more amazing about that growth story is that it was decentralized growth. We were launching markets, and that's how we grew. Having a presence in New York City didn't mean that people in San Diego could request a ride. You needed to set up that market. And so what we did that was so exceptional, and I only really appreciated that in hindsight, was we documented and playbooked everything. Down to like the littlest of tactics in launching a market, such that when it was time to launch, go back to the San Diego example, even though I think San Diego is a very early city for us, but say it was time for us to launch San Diego, we had this foundation of learnings from all prior markets as to how do we do this? And how do we do this faster? How do we ramp this market up faster? And so that was the initial team that I was hired into, was sort of this like launch operations SWAT team, where we were like, okay, let's look at Stockholm. What worked in Stockholm? We're like, what worked in Miami? What didn't? And trying to apply those to all of our new markets, because we were still launching constantly, and empowering those teams with that playbook and that documentation, really what allowed us to scale. Because when we'd go to a new market, we also had to hire all new talent. So they were new to Uber, new to our tools, our systems, our process. And for us, having that playbook was this phenomenal resource just to get people up to speed.
So you had to do it kind of the old fashioned way, right? Because Tango didn't exist yet, that you had to go document all of these processes.
Right. That's right. So it was a lot of documentation. I was more on the data side. So it was also about how do we validate that this is the best practice, and how do we understand, maybe what was unique about Miami, will that apply to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia? It was kind of like these crazy exercises where we were looking at dynamics of different cities and trying to figure out, what's the prescription for this new market that we were launching. But yeah,
wow,
very much the old fashioned way.
Wow. So that's obviously really critical from a market expansion strategy. But what about like economies of scale? Were you looking also into how do we take, existing or core systems and make them handle the increased load or the different use cases?
Totally. So, a good example of this. So I mentioned Miami a lot because I actually helped launch Miami, and launching in those days, we always had this viewpoint of supply drives demand. Supply in this case was drivers being available, ready to take a ride. So whenever we got into a market, all of the effort was put into how do we onboard a driver base that will be able to take rides. And so our onboarding literally looked like renting a Marriott in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, getting the ballroom, having drivers come up single file in a line. We would help them through all of the onboarding documentation. We would get their phone set up, or we would give them a phone. Incredibly manual, right?
Wow.
And so the scale that we eventually reached, when it wasn't so much like, oh man, we have these economies of scale, everything's getting easier. It was more like, okay, if we're going to do this 100 more times, we've got to productize this, right? And so we built, we set up product teams around specifically driver onboarding, or specifically around like device management. Blake Samick, who now I believe he had a stint running product operations at Stripe, and has written a lot about the topic, but he was the one who led device management. He was like one guy who's like, this is a huge problem. How do we get devices in drivers' hands without us having to hand them to him? So we confronted a lot of these things head on, and then just said, okay, let's turn it into a product, which is a good muscle for us to build.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I deal with a lot with my scale stage coaching clients is this idea that when you move into a scale stage, the innovation is not about the product. The innovation is on the business and the business model, right? So the idea is you've built something that it works, right? You've hit the nail on the head. Now this thing is really taking off. Now how do we scale it up? It's not about, oh, well, let's add more features and let's continue innovating on the product. It's no, we need to innovate on our systems, on our processes, on our business model, et cetera. That's the thing that's going to take the thing that worked to scale. And it sounds like you probably had to deal with all possible scaling challenges in that kind of model.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree with that. I think, so I had the privilege of sitting next to one of the earliest employees of Netscape, who was at Uber at the time. He was a product leader. It was my last role at Uber. We randomly had desks next to each other, and I would just ask him questions all the time. I mean, I think he's one of the names associated with even like the invention of RSS. I mean, he's like kind of an old school tech guy, but he's just got so much wisdom. And one of the simplest things he said to me when I was thinking about my next step and I was leaving Uber and I was going to be a founder of residence is he said, take what you did at Uber, take the thing that you know best and it was probably highly manual and turn it into a product. It's like, you led the OKR process, like make an OKR product. And I thought that was interesting, not just from like a founder market fit standpoint, but also to your point around like, yeah, you can look at innovation as like new features or new technology or new ways of doing things, but also there's just so much process within an organization that needs to be streamlined and friction needs to be removed, that the appetite there is still huge.
And it's hard to tell a product team that's been so focused for so long on building the product to say, now you need to turn around and build tools for the organization, right? Now you need to turn around and figure out how do we build the engine that's gonna scale. It's one of the first sort of really big seismic kind of shifts that need to happen in an organization once they hit product market fit, but it's not easy. So after that, you said you went into become a founder in residence and focusing on product strategy. So this is a term that obviously is very near and dear to my heart and one that I'm always looking for insights. I always find it actually I always find it hard to actually explain to a founder what product strategy really means and what does it look like sort of operationally, right? So like a lot of founders, they come to me because they're stuck in all of this tactical work and we focus on how do we streamline and delegate and automate and elevate you out of that tactical role so that you can be strategic. And they say, okay, cool. Now I've got this strategic time. Like, what do I actually do? And what does a comprehensive strategy actually look like? Like, I can't see it. I can't feel it. And I try to describe it. It's sort of like it's the set of decisions that you make that shape your product and shape your company. But in terms of actually productizing or transforming that into a process, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on a practical approach to product strategy.
I think you touched on something that's really important, which is, or maybe alluded more towards it, but product strategy is not like, let me define the mock-ups of what this is going to look like in 3 years, right? It's not, let me envision everything this could be and put it into some like future state. Because that's a trap. Like you need to constantly be listening to customers, constantly doing discovery. Where I think, product strategy can be really powerful for an organization is setting your non-negotiables, setting your principles around no matter what we do or what we build, these are the things we're going to stay true to. I'm not saying that's easier. There are a lot of ways that's harder. But for us, for example, we're product-led, bottoms-up growth. End users find us, they adopt it. We don't necessarily like seek them and tell them to adopt it or give them a demo. It's very discovery focused. And so with that, one of our principles is we will always have a generous free product. And the logic that backs that is ultimately we want to give people a full taste of what it's like to use Tango. And the only point at which they pay is going to be based on usage. So if they want to use it more and more and more and more, eventually they'll get to a point where they pay for it. And so that's the example of a product principle that then when you're confronted with this new information and these decisions that you have to make, you can filter it through those principles. You can always say, hey, does this deviate from any of our principles? It doesn't need to hit all of them on the head, but is this a deviation from the principles that we've set? And I think that for us has allowed us to move quickly because those principles can be consumed by anybody on the team, right? So if we have a PM that's working on something, she doesn't need to go engage the founding team to be like, hey, should we be doing something like this? It's like, no, you don't need to ask us. Like, just think about the principles. And so we have a set of principles that's very clear. That's one element. Another element around product strategy is the vision, but not in the way of like, okay, this is eventually what the product will be, and we've defined the PRD of what it's eventually going to be. But the conversation around how is this going to be really big? How is this going to be really big? How is this going to be impactful? And what are going to be the core things that we need to differentiate on in order for it to be big and successful? And for us, like, we think about that a lot. How are these little decisions that we're making building towards this vision of when Tango's very big and pervasive and within every organization, people are using it multiple times a day. So you want to paint that so that people can work backwards, but you also want to have those principles that guide everything.
Yeah. So I love that. So is there a process or a framework that you think about when you're developing these principles? Because again, I think how we come to those principles is where things get kind of fuzzy. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of, what if scenarios, a lot of maybe A/B testing or evaluation. But when you get into those strategic moments and you say, okay, we need to make a decision about how we're going to approach this that ultimately is going to turn into a principle. What's your thought process there? What's your research process?
Yeah, I would say it's not so much a framework, and at times, like, I rely on frameworks because it helps people think and it guides the conversation. But there are some things within a startup that are just hard and inefficient, right? Yeah. And I think setting these principles is one of those where you're not doing it for efficiency. Like, you're doing it to really set the course. I mean, you're doing it for efficiency later, but that initial strategizing and thinking about, okay, hey, what do you believe some of our principles? What do you believe? Like, it is a lot of hard conversations that you have to hash out. And so, my advice for folks would be, don't shortchange it because it feels like the conversation's going in circles. It will go in circles, but ultimately you're going to be better off for it. And I say this as a founder and CEO of a tool that helps with productivity, right? Sometimes there are just things that you cannot optimize for productivity, and I would say principles are one of those.
Now, again, I think I keep coming back to there really isn't an easy answer. I keep looking for one. Does somebody have an easy answer? A nice way to kind of wrap this up, but strategy is one of those places where it's inherently open-ended, and there's a lot of different ways to approach it. I try to describe it and I try to give illustrations and examples that work, but they just don't account for everything, because when you think of strategy, even just product strategy, there are so many different sets of principles, right, that you can focus on around pricing, around, ease of use, around flexibility, around, scalability, or whatever it is, like product-led growth. There's all these different facets of the strategy, and each one of them, you have to break it off and you have to think about it and you have to talk about it and you have to look at other examples and look at what your competition is doing and look at what your customers are asking for and get all of this data and stir it in the pot and say, okay, what does this tell it? Like, read the tea leaves, right? What is this telling us? And then what are the possible, scenarios or paths we could go, and then pick one. And pick one and either hope that that's the right thing or try to test it or evaluate that hypothesis or maybe even A/B test a few different things. But ultimately it is I think it just comes down to making an educated guess, right? And then leading to getting that conviction that, okay, this is really the right thing, and sticking with it even when times get tough and not doubting it, right? And I think that right there is the hard part, is like you said, the strategy is the thing that you don't compromise when opportunities or threats come your way. But how do you get that conviction that this is really truly the right choice? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you don't. I don't know. I mean, you do, in the sense that I think the order of operations is that vision exercise first, and so that you know where you're going. You know what we talk about it internally as like what our lighthouse is. You know what that is, and then it does make the principles a little bit easier. For us, like I'll give an example. Our sort of lighthouse. One of our lighthouses is that the data set around how people work and what tools they're using is going to be really powerful as the proliferation of tools only increases, as individual employees need more and more tools, are being pulled in a lot of different directions, are being distracted more often. Driving efficiency through a company's tool set is going to be important. And the only way we do that is through a data set. Now, data set is ultimately how our users use the product. What are they creating? What tools are they using? How are viewers engaging with it? Are they finding new ways to do it? Are they getting stuck in certain places? And so when you know that longer term lighthouse is going to rest on data, one of your principles can be our user experience needs to be kick-ass. We will never compromise on user experience, because that's how we get people to engage. When people engage, that helps that data model, right? And so the order of operations does matter. But yeah, I mean, the conviction piece, like, we were able to reach conviction on everything. Building a company would be a lot easier.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's it. That's the name of the game of being a successful CEO, is having, I think, the right intuition and the right foresight, that when you have a belief that turns into a principle, that you have that conviction, even though you're not going to have perfect information to support it or perfect evidence to support it. And you might even have evidence that contradicts it. And you might be wrong, but you got to keep moving anyway. And what you can't do is to vacillate, right? And to compromise your principle. You have to stand for something. It might be wrong, and it might actually lead you to a place that isn't good, but you have to stand for something. Otherwise, you're just going to be a mushy mess of nothing, no principles, right? No,
Yeah, totally. And I mean, think about it this way too. You mentioned A/B testing a little bit. If you just end up being reactive to everything that comes your way, and there's no cohesive framework, how are you truly gonna understand what's working and what's not, right? It's like, okay, we're gonna try all these things that contradict each other, and then if it's not working, what's the thing you're gonna point to, right? Whereas I think kind of staying in your lane and adhering to those principles, you can eventually say, you know what, we picked the wrong one. You deviate a little bit there. So it's an ongoing understanding. And also too, what works for customers today, eventually that becomes their baseline expectation. And it's not necessarily going to work for them tomorrow. They're going to want more.
So, okay, so let's bring us to the present here. Let's talk about Tango. So, I alluded to, or we've obviously been talking around it. What were some of the, the big pains and the first use cases that made you think that there was a there?
I'll give you three numbers that I think maybe we didn't know these at the time, but they do articulate the problem that we saw. One is that, large enterprises have about 215 tools on average that run their business. That's not saying everyone's using 215, but across the organization, 215 tools to execute. That's one number. Lots of tools, lots of ramp time, complicated process. The other one is from a McKinsey study that was, I think, 2020 or 2021, that said the average knowledge worker spends 20% of their time looking for the right information to do their job. So just to make that more tangible, that's 1 day a week. 1 day a week you spend looking for information, because it's either not readily available, or the information that you find is out of date, or just your business is changing so rapidly that you need to define a new process. And then the last one is, scientific research around how quickly people can regain focus. So if I interrupt you or you interrupt me, how do I get back into the flow of work? Takes about 23 minutes. There's more distractions and more interventions and more interruptions than there ever has been. And so with those three numbers, I think the insight that we had was, how do we help people ramp up on their tool sets, find information quickly, lower the barrier to creating documentation around tooling such that there's more of it available, there's more information, there's more documentation, people find those answers. And then how do we serve it up to people in the flow of work such that it's not a distraction? I mean, think about the modern knowledge base today. I go to that knowledge base, open a new tab, I'm going to search for something that I don't know a whole lot about. So I'm probably not searching even for the right thing, the right keywords. And then maybe I'll happen on a page or an article that somebody wrote. And man, I hope it's written by the right person. I hope it was written recently. I hope it's comprehensive. I don't know what I don't know. So how do I even evaluate that? And that to us felt just like we need to move on from that. And so a lot of those insights, maybe not those numbers we've gotten accustomed to over time, but a lot of those insights are what informed, what we've built with Tango.
Yeah. And I'm definitely reliving my experiences with Confluence, especially, right? Confluence is where process goes to die. It's just this, like you said, I mean, not only is everything's antiquated, everything was written, as quickly as possible by some overworked engineer. Nothing is searchable. Nothing is organized properly. You probably don't even have access to the page that you really need because it was written by somebody who was on another team and another project and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I definitely feel that pain. So what does Tango do differently?
So for us, we have focused on kind of those three problems. Documentation is too slow. You don't know the impact of it. And, there's no mechanism for people to really provide feedback. And then the last piece being it gets stale really quickly. So our first product, which is really around knowledge capture, allows people to create documentation, create tutorials as they go through their process in the flow of work. So all I have to do as an end user, turn on the Tango Chrome extension, go use the tools that I use to execute on that process. Once I'm done, turn off the Chrome extension, and we, within 10 seconds, spit out a step-by-step tutorial with screenshots, descriptions, URLs, everything you just did. So we're basically giving people no excuse to create documentation because you don't have to do anything manual at this point. Our second product that we launched actually about a month ago is called Guidance. And so Guidance is built on top of that capture product where, hey, we've created that step-by-step tutorial with Tango. That's helped us tremendously. But now this is a product for the viewer. So when I send that thing that I created with Tango to you, Eric, you can open it and it'll walk you through everything that you need to do on the screen. And that becomes feedback back to the creator to say, oh, okay, you sent it over to Eric. Eric was able to complete 6 of the steps, but then he stalled at step 7, wasn't able to complete that. So something might be out of date there. Maybe revisit your process. And then you on the other side, if you are successful with it, not much you have to do other than follow along. And so that gets kind of at that piece around impact and iteration of process.
Yeah.
The future state for us is going to be around that staleness. How do we use a lot of that data that we get from the creator and the viewer to continually redefine process in a way that's proactive and doesn't require human intervention. I mean, you can imagine a future where we actually understand what websites are changing and what process is changing before the employees do.
Mm.
So that's what we're building towards, and those products will lend themselves to that.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't realize it could do that. So like, I work a lot with founders, and delegation is one of the top three biggest challenges that we deal with here. And there's a lot of reasons why we struggle to delegate. But a lot of it, especially with founders, has to do with one is just I don't have the time to actually do the documentation, right? And so the playbook model is the way to do that. That's the first thing I coach is like just record yourself doing the thing that you're always doing, maybe talk over it and narrate over it while you're doing it, and then just send the recording to whoever the person is, your assistant or your new head of whatever process, and have them create the documentation, and then you just go back and check it. And I've recently recommended Tango as a way to at least get a first draft, right, and get some of the documentation. Now, as you're narrating, there might be nuances or things like that that they want to add to it, but at least that 80% is done pretty much automatically. But then there's the validation. Then this is the I think the hardest thing for founders especially is they feel like they're the best at everything, right? Nobody can do this task better than I can. And so not only do I not have the time to train somebody, but then I also don't trust that they're not going to make mistakes. And so that second piece that you were talking about is actually pretty killer. If you can validate that they've actually gone through and done the process correctly and to completion, that should hopefully make it really easy. So for all you founders out there, there's no more excuses.
Totally. Yeah. And one thing I'll add to that too, I mean, founders are a great use case, but I mean, this is true of any high performer. I think we've all
Mm-hmm.
been there where we've done this calculus in our head where we're like, "Ugh, I should probably create a document around this, but like, it's going to take me too long. I'm going to have to do it kind of like after hours. And then who knows if people are going to use it." And so, yeah, this guidance product is really on that last piece. Now you know how people are using it. You know if they're
Mm-hmm.
successful. They're actually able to provide feedback to you in the flow of that. So they can provide comments or reactions or say, hey, this step broke down because of this. That just helps you make that documentation better so you continue to scale yourself. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, right? So you're right, any high performer, but almost by definition, if you're high performing, it means that you've elevated out of a role and there's work that you're still hanging on to that's low value for you. So you're right. Anybody who's a high performer in their role is probably, reaching towards a new role and again needs to delegate. Doesn't matter if you're an engineer becoming a senior lead engineer. Doesn't matter if you're, a head of a team that's becoming a manager. We're always growing and we're always elevating out of old roles and need to let go of the work that is low value for us. And again, it's something that we all struggle with it. I struggle with it myself.
Mhm.
But again, the best method that I've ever come across is this playbook method where somebody's shadowing you or you're just doing a recording and then they go off and do it. And then you just have that feedback loop of like, okay, I'm going to do it and you're going to watch me and you're going to make the documentation. Then you're going to do it and I'm going to watch you. And then you're going to do it. And then I'm just going to look at the output. Right. And at that point, you say, okay, cool, you own this now. And then let's move on to the next task and the next task and the next task until you can kind of draw the scope around an entire role. Right. So if I'm looking at, say, a product manager, and I'm bringing up a junior product manager, say, okay, go show me how you do a competitive teardown. Go create a storyboard. Go create a journey map for me. Like, go do these different tasks that piece by piece bring all the context together for that role. And then eventually I can say, okay, cool. Now you're the product manager and I'm going to go, do something else, right? I'm going to go become product strategy or product operations or go move to a new product. So that's, again, super fascinating. And I didn't know that guidance tool was there. So I'm going to have to go check that out.
It's pretty new. So
Yeah.
all good if you missed it, but
Yeah.
we launched end of May. So I said a month. It's probably actually been 3 weeks.
Yeah. Very cool. Awesome. So what have been some, big, I don't know, success stories or, big wins, customer success stories where you've seen folks that again have been stuck in the mud, been struggling, and were able to get out of it.
The ones that I'll highlight, and I'm talking kind of broadly here because we have a few examples of this, but is customers that have both an internal and external customer for
Hmm.
Tango. And so I would think about that as like maybe consulting firms or within tech companies like customer success, customer support, sales enablement. Education is a big one for us because they are simultaneously codifying their process and their SOPs using Tango, share with anyone on their team, but they also have a customer that they need to respond to. So you can also imagine a world where a customer writes in and says, oh, I'm having like this horrible issue, like adjusting this piece of my settings. I don't know how to do it. Where does it live? How can you help me? Agent uses Tango to respond to that. And so
Mm.
it's less of that sort of dynamic piece that we talked about where it's, let me create the process, you give me feedback, we iterate together. And to be clear, that back and forth is really what we're building for, the internal piece.
Hmm.
Power usage and sort of the, surprising use case for us was really around that customer engagement. And that's like building
Yeah.
customer relationships where basically seeing people populate their help center, and respond to
Hmm.
tickets ad hoc. And customers were, holy cow, like this solves my issue on the first touch of the ticket. And, completely satisfied because it's walking me through what I need.
Man, so one of my first jobs ever, I worked in tech support at an ISP, at an internet service provider back in the 90s, right? So this was when dial-up was first going mainstream, and for years I'm sitting there on the phone like, okay, what are you looking at? What do you see? What lights are on? When fast forward right to today, it's like, no, just show me what you're doing, and then I'm gonna show you what I'm doing, and we can collaborate on it live. That's yeah, that's huge. Um, so let's zoom out even further here now. So I love to talk to founders about their kind of leadership principles and really just how they approach leadership in their company. So do you have any key values or principles that drive you day to day?
Yeah, you have to. I got advice from a mentor at Uber. This is before I decided I was going to leave and into this founder residence role. But he said when you're evaluating companies, look at the product that they're building, and that's likely the culture that they're creating. So it was oversimplified example, but if you're building, I'll use Uber as an example. If you're building a low margin, highly competitive, sort of cutthroat, rise up against the incumbent of taxi type of product, your culture is going to feel that way too.
Hmm. Hmm.
Whereas, if you're a meditation app, probably going to be the opposite. And so,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think for us, what unites our team and how I approach it from a leadership standpoint is Tango really is all about scaling knowledge within an organization and making sure people have the context, people have the transparency in the workplace to be able to do their job without, wondering, oh, what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to do there? And so a lot of my leadership principles are centered around how do I help people be better? Almost this like servant leadership mindset of like,
Hmm.
what do I know or what unique perspective do I have that can help somebody execute on their job better? And then
Hmm.
also, we approach things with full transparency. I mean, we copy team at tango.us on our investor updates every single month.
Hmm.
We obviously have our board meeting amongst a small group, but then at the all hands that immediately follows the board meeting, share the deck. We talk through what the feedback was. And that level of transparency in my mind helps people have all that context such that if they're in this position of being on an island having to make a decision, they have the same data points that everybody else has. So
Hmm.
that's the culture that we've tried to build. And that's where I've come at it from a leadership standpoint. I think I also got exposure to some founders in my career, Travis at Uber being one of them, where
Hmm.
they want to have their hands in every single cookie jar, and they want to go deep. And in some ways that is good. In some situations when it's a house on fire or a high priority issue, you do want to go deep, but it really hurts trust if you're constantly.
Hmm.
People also talk about how Jeff Bezos will send the emails just with the question mark when there's an issue, right? And that sort of like constant fear of like, what's the founder going to do here, or when is it their week to pick on our team? Like that's absolutely something that I wanted to avoid. And so,
And I had a client at a pretty big company. I won't mention the name, but yeah, they were in the 150 million plus, heavy scale stage, household name. And they referred to it as the Eye of Sauron. So the Eye of Sauron is peering around, and at some point, it's going to come in and focus in on you. And it was literally like, some VP or department head would get like dragged in front of the C-suite, and there was this whole process they'd have to go through to explain the issue and to provide the contingency plan, like what you're going to do about it, and having these regular, almost like weekly checkups. CEO swooping into your office. I mean, it was really really intense, and actually it created an enormous amount of anxiety and stress in my client.
of course,
you know, and also created and it created a culture with a ton of ass covering, right? Every decision everybody made had to be, how are we going to cover our ass here? Like we have to cross our T's and dot our I's and make sure we get approval from everybody and make sure. And it just absolutely killed the pace of innovation.
yeah, you become super risk averse. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't take the big swings for fear of, and with the eye of, that's so funny. The eye of Sauron, I get where it comes from. I don't want to paint this picture of like, oh, Tango's just got this soft culture where anybody does what they want to do. But this Eye of Sauron idea, I mean, what it's trying to do at its core is drive accountability. If you know at any point you can get pulled in front of the C-suite, you need to be accountable to your results, right? And so it's sort of a bad way to do that, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, our approach is always the top priorities should be super, super clear always.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
people should feel accountable to those top priorities. So if you're working on something that's moving the needle for, one of our 2 or 3 big rocks for that quarter or that half, you should expect that you'll be held accountable to that. It's not this like, oh, all of a sudden this is the flavor of the week, because then if you're doing that Eye of Sauron and just dropping in on something, it just shows that you're not prioritizing.
Yeah.
That's kind of my viewpoint on it.
And there's one more point that you made there that I want to pull out. You talked about, being focused on transparency. So this is one of the most critical challenges at the scale stage, where you get information disparity or communication disparity. And so this is, in my opinion, one of the most important principles you can have, especially as you get into a scale stage, is be transparent, because everybody's working on their things. Everybody has their own silo of information. And, you've seen it, I've seen it. You get, especially in large enterprises, different teams that are all working on the same thing, working on the same problem, or teams that are supposed to be working on collaborating on something together, but they're working independently, and then things don't work out when they try to marry the two together. And so transparency, not just in, what's going on with investors and so on, but even, like what you're working on, what are the details, what's the documentation around what it is that you're doing, so that you can help other people who might be solving the same problem, dealing with the same issues, and then of course could potentially leverage from your successes. Actually, I think this kind of goes right back to to the Uber model. If you think about each one of those new markets as being like a team, it's like, well, how do we know what's we're building a new team over here. How do we know what works? Well, we've got other teams that have gone through this before. Wouldn't it be great if we had the access to the same information? And most of the time we don't.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's kind of speaking our language. Like that's
Yeah.
sort of what we believe, outside of the product that we're building or these principles. It's like, what do we believe drives a successful organization? It's, information that's available and accessible to avoid, what you're describing. This we call it information asymmetry, to avoid that, because, when you don't have that, we have people making decisions on, everyone's going to have incomplete information, but you'd want to do your best to like make sure that we're all in the same plane.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Avoiding, clear contradictions, but also you're missing that opportunity, right? Information is an asset. It has value. And for those assets to be locked away, that people in your organization can't make use of it is, well, it's a wasted opportunity. Yeah. Well, Ken, it's been a real pleasure talking with you today. I thank you so much for your time. For everyone out there, go to tango.us and start delegating and start helping your teams get more productive and stop wasting time writing manual processes that aren't going to ever see the light of day.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ken. Take care.